It is Wednesday, my dudes, which means it is time for another First Thoughts and Initial Impressions Epic 7 video. This one will be on Benimaru, the newest collab hero, as well as Twisted Eidolon Kayron, the newest Moonlight 5-star hero, both of these shown earlier this morning. As always, you can expect my 2 cents on the characters. Do I think they're good? Where would I use them? What would I play them on? What kind of artifacts, all that stuff you've come to expect from this video series. As always, if you do enjoy this video, please leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I try to do these initial impressions pretty much every Wednesday that they are available. With our intro out of the way, let's take a look now at the main man's S3, or in this case, I guess, S2 animation, Benimaru.
消えろエルフレア総司令官を任されたからにリムル様のご期待に必ず応えてみせる
Hell yeah! I love the fact that it was Hellflare as the animation for this character. So not only did I get my most requested character for the Slime collab on the rerun, but we got a really sick move with a really sick animation to go with it as well. In the Japanese dub of Epic 7, as well as Slime itself, Benimaru is voiced by veteran VA Makoto Furukawa, who you may recognize as the voice of Achilles if you are a Fate franchise fan, as well as Saitama from One Punch Man. I also want to give a shout out to, even though he doesn't voice Benimaru in Epic 7, his English voiceover artist, which is Rico Fajardo, who is just generally all around a cool dude and also a big card game aficionado like myself. Moving on to Benimaru's stats, he is a Fire Warrior of the Sagittarius Zodiac symbol, which means he shares a stat line with Blue Chloe, Zahak, and another collab hero in Soul Bad Guy. Taking a look at his stats, he has 1,177 attack, 5,542 health, 119 speed, 553 defense, 27% critical hit chance, 150% critical hit damage, 3% dual attack chance, and no effectiveness or effect resistance. Imprint release is attack percentage for the team, and predictably, imprint concentration is going to be critical hit chance because it's the imprint concentration that you need to have a lot of dupes for. So if you want to build the most efficient and best Benimaru, you probably are going to want to pull a lot of dupes. One of the biggest pitfalls, I think, for Benimaru, and it'll become apparent, is actually this stat line. This is a very aggressive stat line in general. Before Conqueror Lilius and her arrival, this was the fastest warrior stat line in all of Epic 7. That is very clearly the best thing about this stat line, as well as the very high starting critical hit chance. That said, when you look at everything else, it's not super impressive. The attack is about average to slightly below average for where you'd want a damage dealer to be, and 5,542 health as well as 553 defense is quite low. This is basically putting us in like the thief / ranger territory, or even like the mage territory for survivability, and it will become very, very apparent very quickly when we talk about these skills in a second why having low base bulk on Benimaru is actually a detriment. Moving on to Benimaru's skills, the first of which is going to be the most important one in his passive skill, Universal Perception. At the start of the first battle, Benimaru gains 50 fighting spirit. At the start of an enemy's extra turn, dispels all debuffs from Benimaru and grants him multi-layer barrier for 2 turns before increasing his combat radius by 25 to 40% depending on Malagora. The effect following an enemy's extra turn can only be activated once every 2 turns. After attacking, when Fighting Spirit is full, consumes all Fighting Spirit to activate Hellflare, that obviously being the AoE attack you saw in the intro. We'll read Hellflare first before talking about Multi-Layer Barrier. Hellflare is an AoE attack that attacks all enemies with a Dark Flame Sphere. Penetrates the target's defense by 30%, and when the caster is granted Multi-Layer Barrier, penetrates defense by an additional 30%. So, if you get Multi-Layer Barrier triggered, you are getting a 60% defense penetration move, which is, I believe, the same as Green Ludwig's. which is very rare. It's basically more damage pen than something like Lionheart Cermia's I Am the Victor. So it's going to hurt. It's going to do a lot of damage and probably win you the game. So you want to be playing Benimaru in situations where you can get the multi-layer barrier, so that way Hellflame just kind of pops off and wins you the game in one turn off of Benimaru, because, spoiler alert, when he has multi-layer barrier, he's going to be able to use Hellflare off of his very first turn. The problem comes in activating multi-layer barrier. Let's read that. Multi-layer barrier is an undispellable unique buff that increases the hit chance of Benimaru by 50% and makes him unaffected by debuffs and some harmful effects. Basically, this move gives you skin in the game against dodge characters and makes it so that Benimaru doesn't really have the mischance against blue units like he normally would because he is a red unit. Other than that, you can think of it very akin to Rem's Demon Mode. Can't really be debuffed, can't really have his cooldowns pushed back, which is why it says some harmful effects. That's basically Lua's cooldown pushback on her S3 Sweet Talk. So that's basically what you get out of multi-layer barrier. Seems incredibly busted on paper. Most of the best characters in the game are characters like Lua, Conqueror Lilius, Spectre Tenebria, Ahmed. These are characters that all have extra turns built into their kit, and they will give you multi-layer barrier, which gives you that 60% defense penetration, AoE attack that's probably just going to win you the game in one fell swoop. And if you are a Guild War player or you are an arena defense player, then absolutely I can stop the review right here on Benimaru. This is a slam dunk must pull character. He is going to be insane into most of the common Guild War defenses and common arena defenses. Absolute game changer in that sense. The problem comes in World Arena, which is usually how I'm evaluating the characters in this game. When the characters in question that you'll be playing Benimaru into are operated by humans, it's not quite going to be the same story. So, Conqueror Lilius, it would be great if she would use her S3 for honor, take an extra turn, and then wouldn't be able to interact with Benimaru because he can't be provoked by her S2 cover. And since he got a huge combat readiness push, he's going to go second, Hellflare, win you the game. In actuality, they'll probably just provoke the Benimaru, assuming he doesn't have immunity, or they'll just use her S1 kneel down and go into him and try and kill him, much like you would with Green Celine. Similar story here with Lua. She simply just doesn't need to press S2 to try to sleep somebody. You can just immediately soul burn S3 Sweet Talk and not take the extra turn, and then Benimaru is basically useless. Spectre Tenebria can just soul burn S1 into him and then immediately use Endless Nightmare into him and kill him before the multi-layer barrier is ever a factor. Ahmed is the one that I think I am most positive about because her S1 is not super great unless she's willing to soul burn it. And I feel like Ahmed players will press S2 because they don't have to worry too much about Hellflare because of the skill nullifiers. But if he's paired with a character like Palladus, maybe you don't have the skill nullifiers to worry about. But even then, he'll get the second turn. He can use his S3, which will, spoiler alert, immediately give you Hellflare. And then that will let you essentially pick off one character instead of a whole team, which might be a game-winning play. But it's not super likely. So yeah, on paper, this sounds like a great proposition. In practice, I'm not so sure. Which means that for Benimaru, in order for him to get serious value out of the kit, you really need him to be bulky because most smart players are just going to try and focus him down like they do Green Celine. He's going to feel very, very similar to a character like Green Celine, and his stats, while better than Celine's in my opinion, aren't too much better. If you recall, with Celine, the biggest problem is that her defense is absolutely terrible, and there's not really a good way to build her bulky in order to survive more than like 1 or 2 hits. I feel that is going to be the same case with Benimaru. So I think if you really want to play Benimaru, you're not going to be able to go super glass cannon unless you, by nature, are already a very aggressive drafter and you're in a situation where essentially, if they don't press the S3, then you will win the game. For example, Conqueror is first, and then your cleave opener is second. They have to press something, otherwise they will lose the game. Those are the scenarios where I think you could get away with an aggressive Benimaru. Otherwise, I think we're going to have to try to play this character Bruiser. Even something like maybe Lifesteal to have him hang on long enough to actually use the other skills in his kit, which we will talk about in just a second. But even if that is the case, you're not going to get the full defense pen on Hellflare because, again, smart opponents are just never going to give you the extra turn. So I think that this is kind of a massive oversight on the character. Maybe it's by design, but the fact that people can just play around multi-layer barrier makes me think that this character may have a very high potential of falling flat in World Arena and may massively undershoot their expectations on where they think this character will land. I don't think that this character is doomed just because of this one kind of observation, but it definitely does put a damper on the rest of the entire character. So let's move now to talk about the other two skills in the kit. We'll start with the S3, Show No Mercy, which I really appreciate that name. That is pretty much the command Rimuru gives him. You acquire 25 Fighting Spirit when you use it, as well as 3 souls. It has a 4 to 5 turn cooldown depending on Malagora. Attacks the enemy by slashing their soul, decreasing their defense for 2 turns, before increasing combat readiness of the ally with the highest combat readiness except for the caster by 15%. When the caster is granted multi-layer barrier, acquired Fighting Spirit is doubled. Multi-layer barrier, again, is, as we just said, that status that cannot be dispelled. So, Show No Mercy is a fairly decent single target S3. 2-turn defense break is pretty good, as well as a minor combat readiness buff. We're going to need to see the multipliers on this thing. I'm hoping that it has fairly high bases so that way we can get away with building kind of a Bruiser Benimaru or like a Lifesteal Benimaru, something that lets us stay in the game long enough to actually get Hellflare off on our second turn, even without multi-layer barrier. I would have liked to have seen Show No Mercy give multi-layer barrier at the end of the turn when you use it, so that way if your opponent is just not going to press a skill, you have another way to actually trigger it, especially because multi-layer barrier is so important to pretty much everything this kit does. Multi-layer barrier obviously gives you the first turn Hellflare off of Show No Mercy, and then it's going to help massively with the damage that's going to be on the S1. Again, we have to see the multipliers. I'm just saying that I would have liked to have seen that. Potentially, if the damage multiplier on either the increased damage on the S1, which we'll talk about in a second, is really high, then maybe I can understand why they didn't want to do that. But again, you could see not having that specific buff if your opponent is not going to ever take an extra turn before Benimaru is off the board, then, you know, the whole kit just feels all right. Like, this character, again, 2-turn defense break on a single target move is good, and a small CR push is good, but without multi-layer barrier, you can see that this, for an ultimate skill, feels pretty lackluster compared to some of the other ones that are in the game. Moving on now to the basic skill, it is Move Out of the Way. You acquire 25 Fighting Spirit upon use, cuts the enemy to attack. When the caster is granted multi-layer barrier, increases damage dealt. And then the soul burn here is for 10 extra souls. You also, again, increase the damage dealt. So it's just strictly a damage move. If your opponent isn't going to give you an extra turn, then again, this is going to feel like a pretty lackluster move. I really hope that the damage multiplier on this thing is quite high. 1.2x is pretty much where I need this thing to be. At base, it really needs to hit hard because this thing does absolutely nothing compared to the other S1s that are in this game. 1.1 at the absolute minimum. If this thing is like a 1x multiplier, it's an absolute fail. I don't care if the damage increase on multi-layer barrier is insane. It's just a fail because the character is going to essentially not have any value from the S2 against good opponents, S3 to defense break, and then have a very middling follow-up to that defense break. That is pretty much unacceptable in my eyes. So again, I don't think Benimaru is a bad character. If you are somebody who only plays a lot of Guild War and a lot of arena, this character is a must pull. He is absolutely incredible for those game modes. And considering that like 90% of the Epic 7 player base does not play World Arena, have fun, enjoy your amazing husbando. He's going to be great. But if you're serious about World Arena, I think Benimaru has a lot of shortcomings, and it's going to be interesting to see over the next couple of days to weeks to see how people adjust and use Benimaru. Again, the way that I'm thinking I would play him is something that is very Bruiser-esque, somewhat tankier, lower on the damage stats, because the matches where I'm bringing Benimaru into, I want just the defense break from Show No Mercy to kind of carry where I'm going. As long as I have enough damage on Hellflare to potentially kill or at least severely hinder Spectre Tenebria, I would feel all right with that. Everything else, in my eyes, should be wholly dedicated towards having a mid-speed build and being as tanky as I possibly can get it. If Benimaru was on Designer Lilibet's stat line or like Dark Corvus' stat line, we would not be having this conversation. He would be absolutely nuts even without multi-layer barrier, because he could take hits and actually stay on the board long enough to provide some serious value and really deter a lot of these broken moves that are in characters' kits. But as he is with Zahak's stat line, it's a pretty hard sell. So this is going to be one of those wait and see things. Definitely need to see the multipliers. Definitely need to see the adaptation. But upon the first morning that he's out here now with the skills revealed, I am trying to remain optimistic, but there is a very real possibility that Benimaru ends up like Teiyu and is pretty much an absolute dud of a character when it comes to World Arena. Let's move on now and talk about Benimaru's artifact, which is Benimaru's Tachi. At the start of the first battle, has a 50 to 100% chance, depending on artifact level, to grant immunity for one turn. At the start of each turn, when the caster does not have a debuff, has a 50 to 100% chance to increase attack for one turn, depending again on artifact level. So those chances are at plus 15 if you pull one copy, 75% chance each. Yeah, this thing's nuts. Absolutely nuts. This is basically not more exactly Guiding Light for Rangers, but this is your warrior-esque Guiding Light. You're gonna want to have as many copies of this artifact as you can get your hands on. This thing is absolutely incredible. So think of the characters that you would play in the warrior class. Little Queen Charlotte wants an attack buff so that her S3, the Will of Lemaire, does a ton of damage. She also wants immunity on the first turn, so that way she is unhindered. Rimuru Tempest is another character that wants immunity and also wants attack so that Devour Black Flame does as much damage as possible. And there are a ton of other warriors in the game that would love to have this. Straze is another character that wants to start with immunity and also really wants to have an attack buff to leverage the difference in his attack versus the tanks. Pretty much like a good 1/3 of the warriors you want to play, for example, like Inferno Kawazu, these are all characters that really want attack buff on them. We always talk about how attack buff is pretty much the best buff in the game. Your artifact gives you attack buff at the start of every turn if you have this up, and it gives you an immunity set to boot, which allows you to basically be very greedy in your builds and go like speed crit when normally you would go speed immunity. Again, this thing is incredible. I'm going to try to get at least 2 to 3 copies and keep them split and just bottle them all the way up. If you've been saving for a very long time, this is a very good banner to blow all of your actual bookmarks on. This artifact is nuts. Benimaru is a limited character, and if he does turn out to be significantly better in the metagame than I give him credit, you're going to want to have imprints of him. Again, I cannot recommend enough throwing your bookmarks at this banner, largely because Benimaru's Tachi is going to be one of the game's premier warrior artifacts. With all that said, let's move on now and talk about ML Kayron.
All living things shall meet an equal end at my feet. Such ignorance cannot be tolerated. For my single, enduring desire.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I just really don't like that S3 animation. There's just something off about it. Something I just really don't enjoy. What I do enjoy, though, is the English voiceover artist for Kayron in Epic 7, which is Mike Powers. You may have heard him as Furious or ML Furious in this game. And you may not know this, but you probably also have heard him as Hoochie, the operator of the game's scam shop. Moving on to Kayron's stats, he is a light thief of the Scorpio zodiac symbol. All right, you know what? I'm not going to read the stats. Roll the clips! I'm begging you, if anyone from Smallgate or Super Creative watches this video, please change the values for a Scorpio thief. This defense is so poor that it is significantly better to stack a bunch of flat defense over any other stat in order to add survivability to the stat pool. I harp on this stat line a lot on this channel because it has amongst, if not the lowest defense rating for a 5-star in all of Epic 7, which kind of pigeonholes the build pass that the character has. The other big change that this character needs is an increase to her durability or survivability in some way, because Politis, her counterpart, can absolutely do this. She is blessed with fairly good defensive stat spread, so she can be played as either a bruiser style character or a glass cannon. That's not the case with Celine, because Scorpio Thief stat line is, in my opinion, still trash because it just has absolutely no defense. You have to build your HP sky high and you're still made of paper for some reason. So yeah, it's safe to say I hate that stat line. I think it's probably the worst one a 5-star can have at Epic 7. And only 1 to 2 characters in the game's history have overcome that stat line, and that is Celine and Violet. And I don't think anyone would say that those are meta-defining characters. They're pretty much niche at best. So, yeah. Tall order for Kayron in order for him to be good when kind of stuck with that stat line. Let's move on now to his skills, first of which is Wandering Eidolon. At the start of battle and at the end of each of Kayron's turns, adopts a counter-attacking stance for 1 turn. Traditionally, a character that is on a counter-attacking stance wants to be very tanky. Already does not bode well for our hero. At the end of an enemy's turn, when the target has a buff, gains 10 Fighting Spirit. When Fighting Spirit is full, consumes all Fighting Spirit to increase combat readiness of the caster by 35 to 50% depending on Malagora, and makes him enraged for 2 turns. The enraged matters for the S3, which we'll be talking about next. So, just looking at this right now, you are going to need to play this character with some form of effect resistance, because the trigger, when he gets to 100 Fighting Spirit, yes, it gives him combat readiness, but it does not give a cleanse. And since this character doesn't naturally have counter attack chance like a character like Mort, they gave it to him in the form of a buff. So if that buff ever gets stripped or gets unbuffable, like how we talked about with Arya and how to play Arya, this character is essentially kind of useless and just a sitting duck. So you will need to build, I feel like, some form of effect resistance on him in order to actually protect the actual counter attack buff on him. The fact that he does have counter, though, as a full-time thing when everything is going his way, and the fact that he has a CR push on him, means that we don't really need to build this character too fast. You can build him pretty slow, honestly, and use your boot slot instead of for speed, preferably for something with bulk stats, but you could also go something like attack percentage boots as well. I probably would go health percentage because of things like the shield on the S1 that we'll be talking in a second. But it's safe to say that you have some serious flexibility. That's the high point, I think, of Wandering Eidolon, because it has such a huge CR push and the fact that it does give you the counterattack buff. You do have a greater degree of flexibility in the boot slot as a result. That said, again, the Scorpio Thief stat line and the fact that you can easily strip the counterattack buff means that you have a tall order ahead of you in terms of gearing this character and the required stats I think it's going to take in order to make him very, very good. Moving on to his S3, it is Sword of Requiem. You acquire 1 soul upon usage, and it has a 3 to 4 turn cooldown depending on Malagora. Unleashes the power of the demonic sword to attack all enemies, and a successful attack, which basically means as long as it doesn't miss, inflicts 2,000 additional fixed damage. When the caster is enraged, fixed damage increases to 10,000. When the skill is available according to cooldown count, decreases damage suffered by 30% when suffering a critical hit. When more than one damage reduction effect is granted, only the strongest effect is applied. Thank goodness there is some form of survivability passive on this character, because again, stat line is really not there. Maybe I am kind of selling this damage reduction passive on Sword of Requiem a bit short, and maybe this is enough to make up for the fact that he has absolutely garbage defense. That said, it doesn't change the fact that we're still going to need a lot of effect resistance, I feel like, and a lot of bulk in order to really bring out the most in this character. He's going to be, I think, a very difficult character to actually gear. As for Sword of Requiem, 10,000 fixed damage to the entire enemy team is nuts. That's basically a Rimuru S3 to all 4 of your opponent's characters. You should just win the game if you actually get to a point where you have the powered up version of Sword of Requiem. What that means is that you're going to need to play Kayron in a scenario where the game goes long enough where your opponent has taken 10 turns and has been buffed during all of them. So what that says to me is that Twisted Eidolon Kayron is really good at fighting slow turn 2 players or slow standard players. That's basically where you're playing this character. It's funny because this character is almost the exact opposite of Red Kayron when you think about it. We traditionally play Red Kayron in a situation where your opponent is very aggressive and you're using his AoE counters to win the game against these glass cannon characters, and his kind of hallmark is a huge single target nuke that could potentially win you the game, that does more damage the lower his health actually is, and we'll come to that when we talk about the S1 in a second. This character is very much the opposite, where he destroys teams that are incredibly tanky if they take too long to win the game. So again, Red Kayron punishes teams that try to win too fast. Twisted Eidolon Kayron is the exact opposite. He looks like a character that punishes people for trying to win the game super, super slow. So if you know a match is going to take a very long time, that's probably where you're going to want to pick Kayron. Just like you would with Dark Corvus, 4th or 5th pick slot most of the time in World Arena. He's going to be an incredibly niche character, and I don't think he's going to be a mandatory pickup pretty much at all. I know we still have one other slot actually to talk about, one other skill to talk about. But yeah, you can kind of already see that there are other characters very similar to this. Like I said, a Dark Corvus could function very similar to this. So if you're in the market for a character like that for World Arena, then yes, Kayron is probably a pickup. Moving on to the last skill here, the S1 Sundering Slash. Attacks the enemy with a sword. Damage dealt increases proportional to the target's lost health. This is the opposite of Red Kayron yet again. He does damage proportional to his lost health. So yeah, again, they pretty much just inverted this character from what you expected him to actually do. When counterattacking, activates Flash Slash. You can soul burn this move to increase its damage for 10 souls. Flash Slash, which is the move he will be countering with, attacks all enemies and grants a barrier to the caster for 1 turn. Barrier strength increases proportional to the caster's max health. Need to see how big this barrier is, because again, character is going to be made of paper pretty much no matter what. So having a huge barrier is a huge boon. That said, it does open you up to things like Desert Jewel Basar or Ai Ningning and their barrier inversions, or even something like Operator Cigarette. And there's another counter potentially to this character. So those are all things to be aware of. Another thing to be aware of, and it's noted in the video, that unlike regular Kayron, who gets 2 AoEs off of Dust Devil, you only get 1 AoE off of this move when you proc Dust Devil. It goes into Sundering Slash instead. They did make a note of that, which is another, I guess, potential knock against the character. So for that reason, I don't know if I could really recommend Dust Devil on this character. I think you're probably just going to want to pick something like a standard dodge artifact just to try to make it harder to die, because I think if you actually can get this character to not get stripped and not get killed super early, he's pretty much a free win as soon as he uses his S3. That's kind of how he works, right? Dark Corvus-esque. If you can hold on, if your opponent can't really debuff you in any way, then yeah, you're probably going to win. But Kayron definitely has a lot of answers, a lot of things that check him. Very Spirit Eye, Celine-esque in that case. Blue Kisei could do it if you don't have a bunch of ER. Red Hand Guy with a Soul Burn. Briarwitch Asaria with a Soul Burn. There's just a lot. There's a lot of things that absolutely ruin this character. And I think that's going to make him feel okay. He's not terrible, right? But again, he's just going to feel very niche, very last picky. Like I said, Celine and Violet are very niche characters with the stat line. I feel very much the same way about Kayron. He's not total garbage, but he's definitely going to be in a rough spot, I think. I think you're going to see some people have success with him, but I don't really see how a character with this stat line that's going to require a bunch of essentially the worst stat in the game, which is effect resistance, that on paper has a fair amount of counters. I don't see how that character has a ton of success outside of the scenarios where, again, your opponent's playing a very slow, standard, tank down team that doesn't have Unbound Knight ROL on it, because that character has already got a ton of strips in the kit and gets an effectiveness buff for free. Yeah, this character is going to be a chore to build. Again, not total garbage, but definitely very niche, just like the other, I guess, quote-unquote good characters that have that stat line. So yeah, that's going to be my thoughts on Kayron, as well as my thoughts on Benimaru. If you disagree, or I missed anything, as always, let me know down below. I would love to hear any and all comments, both positive and negative. Again, hopefully you enjoyed it, and as always, enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Bye-bye now.